In your day-to-day life, you've probably heard about people talk about defense mechanisms. These have become so popular that in many ways they're a sort of common knowledge. But in this video, we're going to go a bit more in depth about defense mechanisms. We'll discuss some of the historical ideas behind them, as well as a bit more of the modern view. And of course, we'll discuss some of the more common defense mechanisms. But first, my name is Keegan. I have a master's degree in counseling, and I'm a licensed professional counselor. I make videos like this to help you better understand various concepts in the world of counseling, psychology, and mental health. To begin, let's define what defense mechanisms actually are. At their most basic, defense mechanisms can be thought of as an unconscious process to protect people from themselves, really. This may be to protect them from having feelings of anxiety or to protect their self-esteem. Generally, defense mechanisms are protecting the person from something that they don't want to feel or something that they don't want to deal with about themselves. Defense mechanisms were made popular by Sigmund Freud. Basically, defense mechanisms were seen by Freud as a way to protect from tension within the personality. Freud referred to them as ego defense mechanisms because he felt the ego is what would produce those defense mechanisms to reduce the tension on that personality. Nowadays, many in the field agree that defense mechanisms are a relevant topic and that they're pertinent to our understanding of one's personality. However, the influence of the id, ego, and superego that Freud theorized are not as agreed upon in the same way. Whether you take a more Freudian view of defense mechanisms or view them in a way that's less Freudian, there's some things that remain consistent. One of these is that defense mechanisms are seen, for the most part, to occur unconsciously. They're also seen as a way for one to protect their own self-image by distorting reality in a sense. One way that this could be seen is that defense mechanisms are a sort of self-deception. Now that we've talked about some of the basics of what defense mechanisms are, let's talk about some of the more common defense mechanisms. The first would be denial, or what some people might call suppression. Denial or suppression is a unique defense mechanism in the sense that this is one that is seen to be more conscious, and some would even say it's deliberate. With denial, the person will refuse to look at something or refuse to see something about themselves, their life, or the situation that they're in. In other words, they're not looking at the reality of the situation. An extreme example of this might be having a loved one pass away, but refusing to acknowledge their death. The second defense mechanism is compensation. With this, a person will work to strengthen a positive trait that they have. But this will be done specifically in an attempt to make up for a perceived limitation or shortcoming that they think they have. With compensation, the person will unconsciously hope that people will notice the positive trait that they've developed and not notice the negative trait or shortcoming that they believe they have. As an example, if a person feels that they don't have a great personality, they may unconsciously become perfectionistic in their academic work to make up for this or compensate for it. Displacement is the third defense mechanism. With displacement, a person will have something built up that they will then take out on someone they perceive as safe. An example of this might be having a disagreement with a coworker and not saying anything to the coworker, but being extremely upset with them, and then taking out this anger or frustration on a child, even if the child has done little to nothing wrong. To say this another way, that anger or frustration with the coworker is displaced and put onto the child in this example. Fourth is reaction formation. With this defense mechanism, the person will act opposite to the internal impulses that they feel. For example, let's imagine that we have a person with an internal unconscious impulse to start fires. If they were to become a firefighter, they're going to then be acting opposite to the impulse that they feel. With the reaction formation defense mechanism, because their internal impulse is to start fires, they act opposite to this by becoming a firefighter. Rationalization is the fifth defense mechanism that we'll discuss. With rationalization, the person uses logic to justify or minimize the hurt that they feel or how they've hurt other people. There are two forms of this actually that we can discuss. The first is sour grapes rationalization, where the person insists that they really didn't want the thing that they actually wanted. Think of this as the person saying they really didn't want the grapes because those grapes were actually probably pretty sour anyway. And so where it seems as though they clearly wanted the grapes, they're now saying like, oh, I don't want them because they're just sour anyway. And so they're rationalizing their discomfort with the situation. The second form is sweet lemon rationalization. In this case, the person tries to say that an unpleasant or uncomfortable situation is actually pleasant or enjoyable. Think of this as the person saying the overly sour lemon is actually really sweet and delicious. Sixth, let's discuss the defense mechanism of introjection. This is where the person takes on the values or beliefs of someone who's more powerful than them or of someone who's being aggressive toward them. As an example, let's imagine that somebody is taken captive by another person. This person who's taken captive could then take on the values or the beliefs of the person who had taken them captive. This would be an example of introjection because that person who's being held captive is aligning themselves more with the person who's taken them and is holding them captive. Those are the first 6 defense mechanisms that we have to discuss, but we're not done yet. We have 4 more to go, and then we'll end with a few more things that might be helpful to know about defense mechanisms. But before we move on, if you're enjoying this video and finding it helpful, please help me out by giving it a like and subscribing. The 7th defense mechanism is projection. This is where the person will have feelings or qualities about themselves that they find unacceptable in some way. And so rather than seeing these qualities or traits about themselves, they instead see them about everyone else around them, even though those people maybe don't actually have that quality or trait. In the Encyclopedia of Counseling, this is described as a person looking in a mirror but thinking they're looking out a window. An example of projection might be a person who has a tendency to lie, thinking that everybody is lying to them. Identification is the 8th defense mechanism that we'll discuss. With the identification defense mechanism, a person will try to closely align themselves with a person that is more successful in an unconscious attempt to be perceived as more successful or worthy in some way. An example of this might be a person who talks about all of the celebrities that they've met. Next, the 9th defense mechanism is repression. This is one of the more well-known defense mechanisms and the defense mechanism that Freudians view as the most important. With repression, this defense mechanism works by unconsciously blocking unpleasant information from one's conscious mind. Keep in mind that this is different than denial or suppression, which are done in a more conscious way, where repression is done more unconsciously. In fact, repression is thought to be done entirely unconsciously, where denial or suppression are seen by some people as being a deliberate thing that's done. An example of repression might be a child who experienced abuse but doesn't have any memory of the abuse happening. Sublimation is the last of the defense mechanisms that we'll discuss in this video. With sublimation, a person will have an unconscious impulse or urge that they act out in a more socially acceptable way. As an example, if someone is really aggressive and has this unconscious impulse or urge to be violent or hurt other people, they may unconsciously channel this into sports like boxing, which are then seen as a more socially acceptable way to be violent or aggressive. Those are the defense mechanisms that we're discussing in this video. Keep in mind that defense mechanisms can be both good and bad. Some of them may tend to have a more positive impact, like sublimation, while others may tend toward the negative side of things, such as displacement, for example. And overall, defense mechanisms are a way for our mind to protect ourselves from something we unconsciously don't feel we can handle. Defense mechanisms don't always have to stay unconscious though. And as we do become more aware of the defense mechanisms that we're using, this process of realizing and noticing these defense mechanisms is called insight. For example, if you realize that there's something that you've repressed, you've now gained insight into this. Hopefully you found this information on defense mechanisms helpful, and hopefully you enjoyed hearing about 10 of the more common defense mechanisms that we can discuss. That said, there are more defense mechanisms that we could talk about. And so if there's others that you'd like to learn more about, let me know in the comments. Again, I hope that you found this video helpful. While you're here, make sure that you check out some of the other videos on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.